Okay, today I'm going to try and speed things along a bit and talk about a proof for the existence of God, or at least an argument for the existence of God. Arguments and proofs, sometimes you can use the terms interchangeably. Anyway, this is the moral argument for the existence of God, or in other words, the argument from morality for the existence of God. It's very simple. It is a non-teleological, purely deductive argument for the existence of God. It goes like this. Premise 1, if God does not exist, then morality has no universal, objective, absolute validity. Premise 2, morality does, in fact, have universal, objective, absolute validity. I couldn't remember the word objective. From these two premises, we get the logical conclusion that God must exist. Now, basically what this says is, if you're going to have any moral standards at all, you are implicitly affirming the existence of some kind of God, a God that is the keeper or guardian or source of moral standards. This doesn't get us the full God of Christian theology. It gets us what in apologetics we refer to as a slice of God. It gives you a very minimal idea, but it's enough to refute the atheist. Now, let me go into some of the ways people try to object to this argument. The most popular, I think, objection is to object to the first premise. And I think most of the modern so-called atheists, or contemporary so-called atheists, object to the first premise. They say that there's no reason to believe that everything is permissible if God doesn't exist. But we find that premise in a lot of very philosophically insightful atheists. I mean, this isn't something that religious people alone insist on. Jean-Paul Sartre based a large part of his whole concept of existentialism on this logical premise. Sartre says, we know for sure that God does not exist, and we've got to draw the logical conclusions of that fact right up to the end, and confess that there are no objective moral values at all. That is Jean-Paul Sartre's point. Now, we are, of course, since we're arguing for the existence of God, we aren't accepting Sartre's premise, which, by the way, he doesn't argue for in the same paper. I'm going to try and link to the paper in the video description. We don't, of course, accept Sartre's premise that God doesn't exist, but we do accept Sartre's argument that if God doesn't exist, then objective moral values do not exist. And then, so the first thing is just, the first objection is just to disagree with the first premise. I think people who do that just haven't thought through their ideology enough. They haven't thought it through to the point where they have reached Sartre's level of philosophical insight. So if you want a real atheist, you go back to Sartre and Nietzsche, not to people like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens. Because they aren't real atheists. ultimately they come out to being more like agnostics, weak atheists. They say the only reason we don't believe God exists is because there isn't enough evidence for him. They're not hard atheists. They don't say God does not exist. They say, well, there's really no way you can know, and all kinds of incredibly weak, spineless arguments like that. If you want a real atheist, you've got to go back to Nietzsche and Sartre. Okay, so that's the first premise. People who deny that lack philosophical insight. Second premise is the other thing people deny. They say, and that's what Sartre and Nietzsche themselves deny. They say there is no objective moral and no standard of values that is universal and absolute and objective. They say all morality is subjective. As argued in C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, the consequence of that doctrine is the destruction of the society that accepts it. Basically, people who deny the second premise just scare me. There's no arguing with them. Because the second premise is a first principle. The first premise isn't a first principle. Sartre argues for it. We're just accepting Sartre's arguments. But the second premise in the argument from morality is a first principle. You can't argue for it. You either accept it or you don't. As I've already covered, some things just have to be first principles. If you're going to have any ethics at all, you've got to start from this meta-ethical premise. Okay, so that deals with the second premise. The third objection people usually bring up to the argument for morality is the objection that the term God is being used ambiguously. I don't think that's the case. First of all, to have an argument where a term is being used ambiguously to make the argument invalid, you have to start using the term in one sense and then switch senses mid-argument. We never do that. The term God is used in the same sense throughout the argument. Second, they try to say that the term God can be interchanged for any other noun to produce an argument which is just as logically valid. To that I would respond that if a kitten is God, atheism is still wrong. What this argument really does is disprove atheism. It doesn't give us the complete God of Christian theology. It's not supposed to. But it is enough to refute the atheist. It doesn't refute the pantheist or the polytheist or the absurd parody religions, but it does refute the atheist. And wow, it's certainly windy today. I don't know whether anyone will actually be able to hear anything I'm saying. So the argument for morality, for the existence of God, is it's probably not the sort of thing that's going to persuade very many people. But what it does is it convicts them. Whether it persuades them or not, it convicts them. It makes them realize that whether they admit it or not, there's something here that they've got to deal with if they're going to be on it. All right. I guess that's enough for today. I'll probably resume episodes next week.